I was curious about how you started your this research, because I understood that your PhD, which you did specifically on neuroscience and the connection in the brain between smell and emotion, I understood this was very new. And so I was curious how you started the research process, because already researching the sense of smell now, I think is still can still be difficult. So I'm sure when you started your PhD, it was also difficult. So was curious about that.
Yeah, thanks for asking me that. So actually, at the time, I wasn't really looking in the brain at all. The brain I got to later. I was really just looking at overt behavior, subjective responses, and so forth. But my background actually from my undergrad was a combination of biology and psychology, initially just in biology. And then for my master's work, I really did it in zoology. And in fact, that's where I got really strong grounding on evolutionary theory, and where that article, where the paragraph about this, connection to this primitive sense and everything really sparked response in me. But in fact, it was while I actually spent a summer before I finished working in a lab when I was an undergraduate, and then did an honors thesis with that same supervisor. And then I took a year off, and this was before the gap year was really popular, but I took a year off and worked for half a year in that same lab, and then traveled all over the place for the other half of that year. But I knew that I wanted to go to graduate school. So I was applying to graduate schools in that interim year and writing what are referred to as the graduate record exams, which you have to write in order to get into graduate school. And they have general ones on sort of like language and mathematics, and then a specific one on the topic you're interested in, like psychology. So one of the questions that turned out in the practice books I had for the psychology part of this exam was, what is the sense that's most connected to memory? And the answer was the sense of smell. And I asked my advisor that I was working with at the time, why is that? And he said, I don't know. It just is. And that really stuck with me as this like very unsatisfying response. And then a few years later, when I was in graduate school and kind of floundering around, so the master's degree in zoology, I thought that that's what I wanted to do, because I've been working with animals as an undergraduate, doing basically, now it would be called neuroscience, but at that point it was biopsychology. But I decided I didn't really want to do that anymore. I wanted to be nice to animals. So the zoology thing was being nice to animals. But I realized that, animals are nice, but, I'm not that passionate about like really what black-capped chickadees are doing, although it's kind of interesting. And I realized, I was interested in learning and memory and emotion, and I wanted to work with people. So I started my PhD actually looking at sleep and the connection between sleep and mood, and especially depression, as well as circadian rhythms. And in fact, I've been able to continue that work while I've been at Brown University with other researchers there. So I've been able to continue the smell work with sleep, in fact, looking at whether or not people can smell while they sleep, and also circadian factors involved in our sense of smell and so forth. So that's actually been really nice to sort of pick that piece up again. I couldn't continue that work on sleep for various reasons to do with the program that I was in at the time. And so I thought, okay, well, I know I'm interested in humans now. I know I'm interested in emotions. So how am I gonna make this all work? So I was taking some courses, and this is when I came across that paper about these researchers that decided to look at the way that smell is a very sort of basic sense that sort of directly affects the limbic system and has this sort of primitive connection biologically also to survival instincts, like approach and avoid, and positive and negative feeling states, that this suddenly lit a light bulb off in my brain that said, aha, I know what I can look at. I can look at the connection between smell and emotional memory and see whether or not the sort of anecdotes are in fact true. Is it the case that when someone has a memory brought back by a smell, is it really different or better than other kinds of memories? So like the classic Proustian sort of experience.
Yeah.
And so this is what I ended up doing my PhD on, and how I ended up doing it, because I'm from Canada. So where I was working was at the University of Toronto, and there was nobody there who could specifically guide me on this. I was very fortunate that my PhD advisor was someone who said, you don't have to do what I do, but he couldn't help me specifically. Basically, here's the rope, go hang yourself. I'm not involved, just go figure it out if you can. And so the person who was the most renowned in terms of the psychological study of smell, someone named Trig Engen, was actually at Brown University. And I contacted him, And I then came to Providence and Brown University and met with him, and he gave me a stack of papers. I did this big road trip at the time. Actually, I went to Brown University. I also went to Philadelphia and met with Dr. Dick Doty, who had his own smell and taste clinic. He gave me a stack of papers. I also went to International Flavors and Fragrances, which is a major aroma chemical company with whom I have worked with many times over the years since then. And they thought, who is the crazy Canadian graduate student who wants, stimuli for her research? But they gave me a whole bunch of stuff. So like I came back with stuff and stacks of papers, and I decided to basically develop a paradigm where I compared people learning associations to emotional images. And I specifically used paintings because I thought they'd be a bit more evocative than just still photographs, because we have so much overexposure to photographs. So I used very emotionally evocative paintings, paired them with either the smell of something, seeing that same thing, or hearing that same thing, or feeling that same thing. So for example, let's say it's popcorn. So you could smell the scent of popcorn, or you could put your hand in a little bucket that you could feel the popcorn kernels. You could hear popcorn popping, or you could see popcorn kernels, or even the word popcorn. And they had to learn that connection between the painting and the various version of that particular cue on day one. And then I brought them back to the lab, and then I would present them with whatever it was. So let's say visual version of popcorn or the scent of popcorn. I say, what was attached to that the first time you were here? And I looked at both accuracy, do they write about the same painting? And then I looked at how emotional that memory for that painting was. And what I found was that people were just as good as saying it was whatever the painting it was supposed to be was, regardless of the format of the cue, whether it was visual or verbal or tactile or olfactory. But when they were recalling the memory of the painting that had been associated to the cue when it was in smell form, their memory of that painting was much more emotional and much more sort of evocative in various other ways than it was in any of the other conditions. And so that was the foundational work, which I then extended to looking into how the brain is being activated during those memories, also autobiographical memories versus, memories of just something you'd have to learn and so forth. And that was sort of the beginning of that part of my career.
And these stacks of papers that you received, what were they? Were they academic papers? Were they so very well researched pieces of work, or like what kinds of things did you receive?
So they were all academic papers. They were really what was known at the time, and there wasn't a huge amount. So, actually there was work that was being done in Europe, there was work that was done in the United States, and it was basically, what people knew at the time. But primarily, since I received them from various researchers, what those researchers themselves had written. But then I started, from looking into the reference section of each of those papers, like, okay, what other papers do I have to go get now? And that began, my literature kind of search, as it were, for this research. But, somewhat fortunately for me, starting this work in this area and not really having a lot of guidance, there wasn't a lot that had already been done. So in a way, like, I could find out pretty much everything that had happened in the field before I got into it, and not feel like, oh my God, there's just thousands and thousands of papers here and I'll never be able to research it. And one thing that also happened during the early part of this work is that the paper in Cell came out by Linda Buck and Richard Axel, which had described, the characteristics of the genes for the olfactory receptor systems. And that was actually a big finding in biochemistry and molecular biology. And that somewhat raised the awareness of people's interest in the sense of smell, but not really from a psychological or sort of basic biological perspective. It was really, if you were in biochemistry, that was really great, or molecular biology, that was really great. But still, it was a little bit positive in terms of the field is moving forward in this direction, even though from a sort of basic behavioral psychological perspective, it really was only sort of inching forward very slowly over time in that particular period. And actually, unfortunately, really hasn't gotten the same level of momentum that the biochemical and more neuroscientific level of olfaction has received.